Okay, welcome everyone today to this interesting, important episode that talks about the just released Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that talks about impact, adaptation, and vulnerability of climate change, invariably how to protect the people from the impact of the climate change crisis. And we know when we talk about climate change, it's already a global reality, but there are some region that feels the brunt of this crisis. Africa, Asia, Pacific, and as the case may be. So there are different brunt of the climate change crisis that we are passing through currently. And this report is also giving a warning, because every IPCC report matters to us, making us to be on track in solving the climate change crisis. And today I have a very important guest, Dr. Lisa Schipper, one of the authors, the incredible authors for this IPCC report that has just been released February 28, 2022. So she's going to be telling us briefly about herself, then we go deep into the interview to tell us what it entails. Thank you so much for coming. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's really an honor to be here as well. So my own research is on specifically looking at what it is that drives social vulnerability to climate change. So I'm particularly interested in gender questions, but I also look at things like worldviews, culture, and religious belief to try to understand how these things influence sort of people's exposure and sensitivity to climate change and other kinds of natural hazards. And then the sort of linked to that is trying to understand how adaptation to climate change and development are related, obviously very closely related, and trying to see sort of when we have adaptation projects, what part of these adaptation projects actually contribute to also helping people develop. Similarly, how do development projects help contribute to adapting to climate change? And so that is my area of research and expertise. And my focus has been in the Global South because I have a PhD in development studies. So I'm particularly interested in places like West Africa, I've spent a long time living and working in Asia as well. I worked a lot in Latin America as well. So
thank you so much for that brief introduction. And just to dive into the issue properly, talking about the IPCC report, and you just mentioned many areas at which you specialized, and it's indispensable for us to mention about climate change, and we'll talk about how we can develop, how we can make structural development and the rest. And so I'm very happy about the fact that you major in that aspect. So I want to ask, what are the key warnings? Because I know every aspect of these thousands of pages of reports really matters. But in summary, what are the key reports that talks about in this report? Talking about the IPCC reports in Africa, loss and damages and all. What do you think we need to know? Or what do you think we need to do that we are not doing?
So yes, the report has I should first point out, there's a very particularly strong chapter on Africa led by a very strong African scientist team. And it's really encouraging to see this the strength in both the coordinating lead authors as well as the other lead authors in the chapter. Of course, because the working group 2 has one of the co-chairs from Africa, from South Africa. So there has been sort of a lot of discussion about particularly the emphasis on what does climate change mean for Africa. But then, of course, we have the other regional chapters as well. I think one of the key findings really is about the fact that we have a lot of adaptation projects that are happening, but that a lot of these are not happening in a way that they really need to be in order to be successful, and that we have adaptation happening that's actually leading to maladaptation, where people become more vulnerable to climate change. And sometimes the reason for this is because it's not, the adaptation plans and projects are not well aligned with existing development priorities. And so in particular, people who plan adaptation projects don't often take into account the underlying drivers of vulnerability to climate change. And so because they don't ask the people, they don't consult local people to say, what are the things that matter? What are the things that are difficult? Instead, often projects will come from outside and be planned elsewhere or planned in the capitals with external funding. And so we have ample evidence to show that with better planning, we can actually have more effective adaptation. But we also see in this report that there is really no point to any adaptation if it isn't very, very closely aligned with sustainable development, and things that are limits to adaptation, for instance, a lack of education or financing or gender inequality. These are things that will be addressed through development processes. And so essentially what we're saying is that you can't really do adaptation without considering development. It is like the key for adaptation. But then also, at the same time, to have climate resilient development, we also need to be aware of the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because climate change adaptation will also be limited at some point, and by increasing warming. As the warming increases, every increment of warming that is there adversely affects our opportunities for adaptation, just like it adversely affects our opportunities for development. So, I think that while the message about the link between climate change and development has been something that the IPCC has talked about for the last 20 years, at least since the third assessment report that came in 2001, it's really a much clearer picture now. But we see adaptation happening, but we also see it could only work if we align it really closely with development. So I suppose that that is positive, especially because we see that the biggest gains can be made in places where you have, for example, very rapidly urbanizing locations. And you'll see that, of course, in a lot of African countries, how you have huge influx of people coming to big cities, and this is the opportunity to develop in a climate resilient development way, of course, with the proper financing to support that.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've mentioned quite a number of things, and talking about the fact that emission cannot keep rising while we are trying to adapt. It doesn't work that way. We have to reduce emission, then try to adapt to it. That way it makes resiliency to work. It makes every other solution to work. And just to point out what you also mentioned, that this report talks about carrying the local communities along in the implementation of all of these things, so that it suits the prevailing situation. Because from what you just mentioned, it shows that not all projects on adaptation that can work in a particular areas, because they all differ. They are all unique in different forms. And I really appreciate that point that they talked about. And you also talk about looking at gender and development issue, because I know that in the bit of us trying to make development, sometimes it leads to more emissions, or it leads to more vulnerability to climate change. So tell me, how do we make development possible without increasing emission or creating more crises or deeper crises, using the gender lens and different lens that you have used or that have been used by you as one of the authors? And so just my next question that talks about development. You major on development issue, and as one of the lead author in that aspect of the IPCC report, I want to ask that, is development that leads to more emissions? And so how do we bring in development in places like Africa that talks about adaptation without increasing emission or vulnerability of the population and the rest? So I want to know those connections using the gender lens and different lenses in trying to see that we bring in sustainable development without emissions, trying to be resilient enough and trying to go green.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the key questions, especially for a place like Africa. Is it fair for the global north to have, already advanced so much with the climate has changed, and now we have to rethink development, and there's so many regions, especially Africa, that haven't had the chance to develop much yet. I think, though, that there are differences between the kind of development that we expect, is part of a sustainable development. And obviously, the advantage that developing regions like Africa have is that we can learn a lot of lessons from what has gone wrong in other regions. So, for instance, in Asia, you have a tremendous amount of concrete infrastructure, causing a lot of additional exposure to people, flooding, coastal erosion, and so on, because of the way this infrastructure has been constructed, without really thinking about the implications or the long-term kind of consequences. And so I think, in some ways, the African continent broadly has an opportunity here. The other thing to also keep in mind is that, there are lots of different kinds of development. So, we're talking about things that are fundamental for being able to help people adapt to climate change, like education. Education is absolutely critical everywhere, but it also helps us move towards a climate resilient development future. So, these are things that are part of kind of basic development needs that are part of the sustainable development goals that the whole world has agreed to, but they're also a stepping stone towards climate resilient development future. And finally, I would also say that one of the other opportunities for climate resilient development are in cities. And in Africa, of course, you have a tremendously fast, quickly growing cities in lots of countries. And these urban spaces are where we have the chance to invest now in ways that are both low carbon for the future, but also take into account potential floods and other kinds of hazards that might come with climate change, so that we're making sure that simultaneously helping to develop in a sustainable way, but also thinking about climate change and the implications both of the development itself, so it doesn't increase lots of greenhouse gas emissions, but also helping people to adapt. And I should say also that a recent study that we didn't include in the IPCC report because it came later shows that by raising the most poor people in the world out of poverty, greenhouse gas emissions will only potentially rise by 1% and not more than that. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because that means a huge quality of life improvement for lots and lots of people, but only a small amount of greenhouse gas emission increase.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that important point. And for that report, I saw the report and I wondered that if raising people out of poverty is not the solution to emission, it shows that richer nations are really the ones, are really the polluters, or the rich class of people are really the polluters of that leads to climate change, because definitely the world's poor comes from Africa, and yet we are not responsible for all of these emissions, and yet we are being disappropriately affected. And also, what I also wanted to pick out from this interaction, you talked about education as a way of bringing in development that will be sustainable enough. And just for me to ask you the next question, that talking about development, we need sustainable finance to make this possible. So how do we get development with sustainable finance, and looking at the fact that there's a need for us to include gender sensitivity in trying to be sustainable? Because according to the former Secretary General, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he mentioned the fact that gender equality is important in actualizing sustainable development goals. So how do we merge those two together, sustainable finance, climate finance, and gender equality, to see that we're able to move on out of this vulnerability? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the key issues is, of course, that we show in the report how gender inequality is a key driver of vulnerability, but simultaneously that gains in moving towards more gender equality also contributes to sustainable development. And I think you're absolutely correct that finance is a big part of this. You have to keep in mind that there are one of the sort of the biggest challenges for that sort of worsens gender inequality is often in many places men control the finances in a household, and women don't have the same kind of decision-making power. So I think there have been studies that show that when women have opportunity to get microcredits or even other kinds of credits, they're actually much more responsible in paying back the loans than men. It's partly because women have more sense of responsibility, but also because women tend to be more careful and use the money for the things that they know will return the money for them, so they're not throwing it away on alcohol or something like that. But I think that the key issue to keep in mind, so that there are huge gains to be made for in sort of a small dimension of sustainable finance by making sure that there is a lot more equality in terms of women's access also to funding. But I think, similarly, one of the issues around finance is, of course, we have differences between loans that come from, for example, the World Bank or other kinds of big institutions, African Development Bank, and also this sort of bilateral assistance or even multilateral assistance where it's actually donation through projects. And I think one of the key things that we've seen in the report is that a lot of adaptation projects carried out in the Global South are not successful, and are in fact making people worse off, in part because they're not really taking into account the needs or the circumstances of the most marginalized people. Those projects don't often involve the most marginalized groups, who are often women, but also ethnic minorities or other kinds of kind of traditionally marginalized groups. So I think, spotlighting gender equality will, and understanding that is a pathway to addressing a lot of different issues, including the finance issue and including also adaptation and reduction of vulnerability.
Thank you so much. You've just given us a deep reflection of what the question looks like, or what the answer looks like. And for the first time, IPCC is bringing out reports that talks about colonialization being the root cause of all of this exploitation or the climate crisis that Africa has been faced with, and closely linking it with the loss and damage, who to pay for what and who not to pay for, So how do you link that up, looking at loss and damage, then the colonialization of what the IPCC pointed out? And then how do we fix that in terms of moving forward on development issues?
Well, I mean, I think one of the first steps is that acknowledgement that of the role of the past colonial history in fact, recognizing that colonialism is not something of the past, I should say, but it's actually still something very much in the present, right? And that the effects of colonialism continue to reverberate and are sort of the major drivers of, in many places, are the major drivers of why people are vulnerable to climate change in the first place. And so the reason why we have that in the report is because over the last few years, we have seen a huge amount of more research that bring out these questions. And so, the IPCC authors, what we do is we assess literature. We don't write our own literature. And so it's not a research project. So we're able to draw on all of these other publications to say, we actually know quite a lot about this. And we can say with certainty, in fact, I think we have high confidence that the role of colonialism is tremendous. One of the things that steps into is something that's a little bit less, I say it's a bit gray. I mean, it's a little bit not quite as explicit in the report, which is about responsibility. And you've talked about the loss and damage debate. And there is really, there are a lot of dimensions to the debate in terms of sort of, how it couples with when we talk about the irreversible losses and the things that can no longer be fixed, and also how that influences the kind of financing that might be available to do something about this. If we're basically looking at certain ecosystems disappearing, is it worth spending money to try to help them if we know that they're basically disappearing at a certain global warming level? And similarly, there of course then these very complicated issues around sort of the losses in cultural heritage or other kinds of very sensitive and non-economic issues. And there, it's not just a matter of compensating through financing, because that doesn't bring back the loss of cultural heritage, the loss of identity or history. But I mean, this debate is about who is being affected and who is responsible. And while we have in the IPCC report several recognitions of this through the colonialism, for instance, but also the mention of the past emissions and the role that past development decisions have played, it isn't really a topic that we address head on, in part because it's very difficult to keep, how can I say, it is a subject that is contested, and I think it's not something where, it's a very divided area. And so regardless what the research says, I mean, it's quite clear that obviously those who have emitted the most in the past, if you want to say that, we know who those countries are. But I think there's, it becomes very political when you start talking about, is that then also the responsibility to pay? And that becomes sort of out of the scope of the report. So, and just to remind everybody that the report doesn't include any recommendations or is not policy prescriptive. It's only there to offer the policymakers the scientific knowledge base for making their decisions. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think recently there was a report that was released on climate change threatening Africa's natural and cultural heritage, that was published in Nature, and likewise Carbon Brief brought out that report written by Darcy, and which she asked for my comment. And I mentioned the fact that in Africa, our natural heritage defines us. So a cancelled natural and cultural heritage could mean a cancelled history or erasing our story. And so it's very important that meeting up our climate commitments and demands, it really matters, because just as you mentioned, finance cannot really compensate the loss and damage that has been done to our environment. And that is really a remarkable report coming up from IPCC, like others like you, that were able to bring up that report. And just to ask as a concluding phase of this interview, so you can go ahead.
Okay, so the final message about this report is that every decision we make now matters for being able to put us in a direction of climate resilient development. And I think that's not to say that we recognize that the decisions made in the past as well have a huge impact, because those decisions, including colonialism, including funding and how that's been distributed, including things about that have led to greenhouse gas emissions, those things have contributed to putting us in the position where we are now, and they have contributed to constraining future opportunities as well. And then when we add together the fact that we're already at 1.1 degrees warming, and we are very quickly going towards 1.5 degrees, and the fact that this report shows that our ability to adapt is limited, not just by the fact that we already have so much warming that ecosystems and human systems are affected, but also by the fact that we are not doing it well, and as it gets warmer, it'll be even more difficult. It means that this window of opportunity is really closing. So with that in mind, it becomes even more important to think about each decision that we make now in all sorts of ways. And I guess the final thing to say is the reason that these IPCC reports are so important is because they bring together thousands and thousands and thousands of research studies that really offers an opportunity to see what exactly is the knowledge on impacts of climate change, on adaptation to climate change, and on vulnerability to climate change. And there's no other single publication that has the same kind of condensed information in it. So it really offers us a snapshot into both what we know, which is a lot, but then of course there's some research gaps as well. But the most important thing is that we know so much that we should act now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your deep insight and perspective, Dr. Lisa Schipper. And just for me to just conclude this section, really important that we acknowledge all IPCC reports. We don't just have to keep waiting and keep the warning going. We have to act now and act in the right direction because we don't have time. There's some loss and damage that cannot be brought back or restored. It's lost, and so we have to start now, bringing in every infrastructure's development that will not affect or harm our environment in any way, and looking at the fact that climate change is beyond environmental matters. It is now an energy issue. It is now different issues that cut across our economy. And this is the deadliest pandemic that has no vaccine. So it's going to get to a point of no return whereby every action we try to bring in might not matter anymore. So this is a time for us to act and act in the right direction and act faster than it is, because winning the race against climate change demands a lot of political will, a lot of commitment, a lot of actions to come into reality, and not just only talking the talk. So it means us walking the talk. So there's a lot that is needed for us to do, that we need to do quick. And thank you so much again for that insight, Dr. Lisa Schipper. We're really honored by your presence today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.